If you thought Infinity War was the only possible version of that story, then you're missing out on the battles against giant serpents, fused heroes, and destroyed planets that Marvel filmed but never showed you. But in this video, I'm going to show you the last-minute decisions that saved the MCU from disaster, the cut characters that changed everything, and the complete scenes that cost millions but never saw the light of day. So by the end, you'll understand that the epic movie you know survived by pure creative luck, and the MCU you're familiar with is now on a path none of the characters or creators could expect.
Picture this. Instead of Thor flying in with Stormbreaker to wreck house in Wakanda, it would have been Steve Rogers making that triumphant entrance. Now imagine Bruce Banner transforming into Professor Hulk right in the middle of the final battle, intellect intact, demolishing Thanos' minions. And to top it off, visualize Thor fighting a planet-sized serpent instead of forging his new weapon with Eitri. Sounds insane, right? Well, all of those things were about to become reality. Marvel came this close to releasing a completely different version of Infinity War, one that could have been a total disaster or an even more epic experience. The difference between what you saw and what could have been was decided in boardrooms, on film sets, and in visual effects computers, where thousands of decisions changed the course of the MCU forever. This isn't just some casual what-if scenario. This is the real story of how one of the most ambitious movies in history was about to go completely off the rails, how the writers panicked over their own drafts, and how actors like Chris Hemsworth basically saved their characters from being irrelevant. Buckle up, because you're about to discover the creative chaos behind the cameras that nearly destroyed the Infinity Saga before it could be completed.
Here's the uncomfortable truth about the MCU. Kevin Feige and his team didn't have the slightest clue where they were going for years. When James Gunn was writing Guardians of the Galaxy, Feige pulled him aside and dropped a bomb. Hey, remember all that weird stuff we've been putting in the movies? Well, now they're gonna be Infinity Stones. Could you do us a solid and write a scene explaining what the hell they are? Gunn, being the professional he is, stepped up and wrote the entire collector sequence in roughly 3 minutes. Yeah, you read that right, 3 minutes. To explain one of the most important concepts in the entire saga. That tells you everything you need to know about how improvised this whole thing was. But the chaos doesn't end there. Turns out the Power Stone that appeared in Guardians was originally red. Why'd it change to purple? Because Marvel decided well into production that the Aether from Thor the Dark World should be the Reality Stone. So Gunn had to change his stone's color in post-production to make everything line up. They were basically rewriting the universe's continuity while the movies were already finished. These kinds of last-minute changes and retroactive adjustments prove that Marvel was constantly making up the rules on the fly. The most mind-blowing example of this is the Infinity Gauntlet that appears in Odin's vault during the first Thor movie. When they decided Thanos would use the real gauntlet at the end of Age of Ultron, they had to do a pretty gnarly retcon and reveal in Ragnarok that the Asgardian one was fake. Feige even admitted it without shame. They threw it into Thor as a simple Easter egg to excite fans without having any concrete plan for what it meant. It was pure nerd speculation. Same thing happened with Captain America's half-finished shield appearing in Tony Stark's workshop in Iron Man 2. Another empty wink tossed out there hoping they could make it mean something someday. Marvel had this habit of dropping these random references, getting people hyped even though they had no idea how to connect them later. They were betting that when the moment came, they'd figure out how to put the pieces together. And by sheer luck, most of the time it worked.
To write what would be the MCU's most ambitious film, Kevin Feige went straight to his ace in the hole, Joss Whedon, the creative architect behind the first 2 Avengers movies. Seemed like the obvious choice, right? The guy had already proven he could handle a massive cast, had experience with team dynamics, and knew the characters inside and out. But Whedon was burned out. After the creative battles with Marvel during Age of Ultron, where the studio messed with his final cut and forced him to include scenes he didn't want, the director just couldn't take it anymore. He was mentally exhausted, emotionally drained, and on top of that, he had an even more fundamental problem. He didn't understand Thanos. Whedon admitted it publicly later. No beating around the bush. He didn't grasp the character's essence and didn't know how to make him work as the central villain of an epic film. To him,
him, Thanos was just the purple guy who showed up in post-credit scenes doing nothing interesting. He didn't see how to turn him into a convincing threat or someone with enough depth to carry a 2.5-hour movie on his shoulders. So Marvel had to switch strategies. They hired Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, the writers behind the Captain America themes, including Civil War. These two got to work and produced at least 6 completely different drafts of the script. 6 distinct versions of Infinity War, each exploring radically opposing narrative paths. That means the movie you finally saw was just one of multiple possibilities, and many of those alternate versions sounded like total disasters. The writers themselves admitted later that several of their early attempts were a mess that didn't work at all.
Hit that subscribe button if you want to discover all the paths Marvel almost took that would have completely destroyed the MCU, because what's coming next will reveal the craziest scenes they filmed but never finished.
One of those early drafts sent Marcus and McFeely straight into existential panic. As they admitted later, when they presented that script, nobody at Marvel liked it one bit. And the main problem was Thor's story, which was a narrative disaster from start to finish. Instead of traveling to Nidavellir with Rocket to forge Stormbreaker in a sequence full of emotional weight and direct consequences from Thanos' actions, Thor and his raccoon buddy would have had to retrieve the axe in the middle of an epic battle against Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent. If you know your Norse mythology, you know Jormungandr isn't just any creature. It's a serpent so massively gigantic it literally coils around the entire earth, biting its own tail. According to legend, it's destined to emerge during Ragnarok as Thor's ultimate and final enemy, the nemesis that will eventually kill him in combat. On paper, it sounded spectacular. Thor facing his mythical destiny in the middle of the Infinity Crisis, a mind-blowing visual fight that would connect with the character's mythological roots. The problem is that when you read it in the context of the complete film, the sequence felt totally disconnected. It was basically a video game side quest, a random mission that interrupted the main narrative instead of contributing to it. It had no thematic or narrative relationship with Thanos, who was supposedly the central villain of the entire movie. Compare that to what they ended up filming. The visit to Nidavellir connected directly to the atrocity Thanos had committed by massacring all the dwarves after forcing them to forge the Infinity Gauntlet. Aichu was left as the only survivor, traumatized with useless hands, a living witness to Thanos' cruelty. That scene added emotional weight, established the consequences of the villain's actions, and gave Thor a renewed personal motivation. The giant serpent offered none of that, just empty visual spectacle. But the problem with Thor went beyond the plot. The character's portrayal in those early drafts had him as the team's serious, formal guy, basically the same boring Thor from the first Avengers movies. No humor, no distinctive personality, just a solemn warrior saying generic lines about honor and duty. Then Chris Hemsworth showed up on set and basically put his foot down. He told the Russos the character needed to evolve, that he didn't work like that anymore. And he was right, because Ragnarok was filming simultaneously, and Taika Waititi was completely reinventing the God of Thunder. Once Marcus and McFeely saw the Ragnarok dailies with Hemsworth leveraging his natural comedic timing and willingness to look ridiculous, they realized the actor was absolutely right. As they explained it themselves, after Thor: The Dark World, which by the way they also wrote, absolutely nobody was calling Thor their favorite Avenger. The character was dead in the water, the least interesting member of the team. But in Ragnarok, by exploiting Hemsworth's comedic charisma and letting it be funny without sacrificing emotional depth, the character suddenly came to completely new life. He became one of the audience's favorites almost overnight.
As a direct consequence of that original story, where Thor fought the giant serpent without any narrative sense, he also wouldn't have made that triumphant, unforgettable entrance into Wakanda that we all remember. That perfect cinematic moment where the God of Thunder descends from the sky with Stormbreaker, Groot, and Rocket, wrecking everything left and right while Immigrant Song plays mentally in your head. That was originally designed for Captain America. Anthony Russo explained the logic behind this decision. The central emotional premise of Infinity War was always clear. The Avengers lost against Thanos because they were divided, fractured by the devastating consequences of Civil War. The broken relationship between Tony Stark and Steve Rogers was the backbone of the entire conflict. The message was blunt. A divided team can't face an existential threat. Therefore, Marcus and McFeely thought Steve should be practically absent for most of the film. After all, he was a fugitive on the run, hiding in the shadows, living underground to avoid being captured by world governments. Keeping him out of the action until the last moment, then having him appear dramatically in Wakanda to save the day, seemed like the right creative decision from a narrative perspective. The problem is, Marvel Studios didn't like that idea at all. The executives and the Russos themselves, after reflecting, realized that keeping Captain America out of the movie that long was a fundamental mistake. The audience needed more time with Steve Rogers, especially considering he was one of the MCU's emotional pillars. You couldn't have a movie called Avengers where one of the most iconic Avengers barely appeared. Plus, there was a cast balance problem, with so many characters competing for screen time, leaving Cap out that long completely unbalanced the structure. After the studio's rejection and much internal deliberation, the Russos decided to bring Captain America in much earlier in the narrative. They gave him scenes in Edinburgh saving Vision and Wanda, allowing him to have a more present arc throughout the film, and giving fans the necessary time with the character. And that epic triumphant entrance moment into Wakanda, that cinematic instant that originally belonged to Steve Rogers, got transferred to Thor. And it turned out to be the right call because Thor needed that redemption moment after everything he'd lost, while Cap already had enough emotional weight in other scenes of the film.
In one of the script's most ambitious versions, Infinity War included an entire sequence where the heroes entered an alternate dimension, the Mindscape, a mystical realm controlled by Doctor Strange. This reality forced each character to literally confront themselves, facing their internal fears and psychological conflicts in physical and visual ways. Within this plane of existence, Bruce Banner would have come face to face with Hulk in the most symbolic setting possible, the Sakaar Arena from Thor Ragnarok. There, in that Colosseum where Hulk had been champion and celebrity, Banner would have finally confronted the fundamental conflict between both personalities. It wasn't just a physical fight, but an existential negotiation between two entities sharing the same body. The result of that internal confrontation would have been revolutionary. The birth of Professor Hulk right in the middle of the Battle of Wakanda. Imagine the scene, Bruce Banner inside the Hulkbuster, desperate because Hulk refuses to come out after the beating Thanos gave him at the movie's beginning. Enemies surrounding him, everything seems lost, and then the transformation. The plan was for Banner and Hulk to finally reach a compromise, a fusion of their two identities. Banner would accept Hulk's strength and rage, while Hulk would accept Banner's intelligence and control. The Hulkbuster would explode from within, pieces of armor blasting in all directions, and a completely new Hulk would emerge. Massive, green, but with the intelligent eyes and calculated posture of Bruce Banner. Professor Hulk would have demolished Thanos' minions with a combination of brute force and tactical strategy we'd never seen before in the MCU. On paper, it sounded spectacular, a triumphant moment that will give Hulk a complete arc within the same film. But there was precisely the problem. That moment felt too triumphant, too victorious for a movie that was designed from its conception as a crushing defeat. Infinity War's third act was intentionally built as a relentless march toward failure. The heroes fight with everything they have, push themselves to the limit, and still lose. Thanos wins. Introducing Professor Hulk in the middle of that final act would have given the audience a significant victory that would completely undermine the dramatic tension. It would have sent the wrong message. The heroes are gaining ground, there's hope, and that contradicted the film's fundamental purpose. As a result, Marvel scrapped the entire Mindscape sequence late in the production process, removing Professor Hulk completely from Infinity War. But the problem is they'd already filmed parts of Endgame assuming Professor Hulk would exist since Infinity War. Specifically, they had to go back and reshoot Endgame's first act, with the surviving Avengers travel to Thanos' farm to confront him. That sequence originally included Professor Hulk already fully formed. They had to redo it with Hulk still separated from Banner, then decided to introduce the fusion after the 5-year time jump. In that diner scene where we see how each surviving Avenger has changed and processed the snap's trauma. For tons of fans, this decision was a massive missed opportunity. Hulk never got his revenge against Thanos, never
had a real cathartic moment after that humiliating beating at Infinity War's beginning. The deleted sequence would have given him that complete arc of redemption, transformation, and personal triumph the character deserved. Instead, Professor Hulk simply appears 5 years later as a done deal, already accepted and resolved off-screen, without the audience witnessing that crucial transformation moment. It was one of the most controversial creative decisions of the entire Infinity Saga.
In early script versions, Infinity War would have opened in a radically different and way more ambitious manner. Instead of starting with the ambush on the Asgardian ship at Hulk's crushing, the movie would have begun with Thanos completely devastating planet Xandar, home of the Nova Corps, the intergalactic police force that had been guarding the Power Stone since the events of Guardians of the Galaxy. The sequence would have been a massacre of epic proportions, Thanos and his army descending on Xandar, the Nova Corps trying to defend their world with everything they've got, massive space battles, cities being destroyed, and finally the near total annihilation of the entire organization. It was basically the equivalent of witnessing Krypton's destruction, but with Thanos as the active villain instead of a natural disaster. But the early drafts didn't just include this destruction. They would have also introduced a completely new character to the MCU, Richard Rider, better known as Nova. The idea was to establish him as the Nova Corps' only survivor, the last man standing after Thanos eliminated all his companions. Rider would emerge from the ashes as a traumatized warrior, carrying the weight of the entire Nova Force concentrated in him alone. His role in the film would have been crucial, becoming the Herald, the messenger who warns Earth of Thanos' imminent arrival. He'd be the one crashing into the Sanctum Sanctorum to alert Doctor Strange and Tony Stark, the same narrative role Bruce Banner plays in the final version. Nova would have been the one explaining the threat, providing context about Fantasy's power and linking the Avengers to the broader cosmic conflict. The complete Xandar sequence supposedly lasted close to 45 minutes. 45 minutes of character establishment, planetary destruction, and hero origin before the minion plot even started. It was a massive narrative proposal that would have completely changed the film's structure. But the Russos finally reached the conclusion it wasn't necessary at all. Their reasoning was solid. The audience could easily infer how Thanos obtained the Power Stone without needing to see it happen on screen. We all remembered Xandar had it since Guardians. Seeing Thanos already with the stone in his possession at the movie's beginning immediately conveyed the message that he'd conquered that world without needing to dedicate almost an hour of footage to it. Plus, adding that long detour at the beginning would have brutally inflated a movie that was already overloaded with dozens of characters and multiple storylines. Infinity War needed to move fast, maintain momentum, and throw the audience straight into the action. 45 minutes of prologue would have killed that pacing before it even started. The craziest part of all this is that according to industry reports, a large part of the sequence was filmed on location representing Xandar. Marvel invested real money filming the planet's destruction, but the visual effects needed to complete those shots were never finished. Why? Because the cost of finalizing 45 minutes of intensive cinematic level CGI for a sequence that would definitely never see the light of day was simply astronomical and unjustifiable. So somewhere on Marvel's servers exists raw footage of Xandar's destruction and Nova's origin in the MCU, unfinished, unprocessed, and probably destined to never be publicly released. It's money thrown in the trash, but ultimately the right creative decision.
Subscribe if this breakdown is showing you the absolute chaos behind Marvel's decisions, because in upcoming videos, I'm gonna unveil more secrets and alternate versions of other MCU movies that almost screwed up the entire franchise.
When you saw the first post-credit scene from the original Avengers movie back in 2012, you probably noticed something odd in the dialogue. After Loki fails to conquer Earth, one of Thanos' minions reports the failure with a specific, deliberate warning. Challenging Earth's humans is to court death, and instead of getting angry or feeling deterred, the Mad Titan smiles with disturbing complicity, as if that warning actually excited him. That moment wasn't accidental. It was a completely intentional nod
nod to Thanos' original motivation in the comics, where his genocidal obsession stems from his twisted love for Lady Death, the physical and literal embodiment of mortality itself. In Jim Starlin's stories, Thanos is in love with this cosmic entity and seeks to impress her by destroying half of all life in the universe as a demented romantic offering. It's basically the sickest, most grandiose courtship ever conceived. For a significant time, it seemed like the MCU was setting up exactly the same dynamic. That line of dialogue, that smile, everything pointed to Lady Death eventually appearing as a real character in Infinity War. Fans constantly speculated about who would play her, what she'd look like, and how her relationship with Thanos would work on screen. But the Russos finally decided not to introduce Lady Death at all. The reason was purely practical. Adding a completely new cosmic entity with its own visual design, its own mythology, and its own role in the narrative would have brutally complicated a story that was already packed to the brim. As Stephen McFeely explained in later interviews, including Lady Death would have required creating a completely new plane of existence in the MCU, an entire realm of death that up to that point hadn't been explored or even mentioned. That meant establishing rules, visuals, internal logic, and explanations that would consume valuable screen time the film simply didn't have. Infinity War was already juggling over 20 main characters, each needing their moment to shine. Adding another important character, especially one as conceptually complicated as the personification of death itself, would have been a fatal mistake. Instead, Marvel opted to leave subtle but recognizable nods for comic fans who knew the original story. The most notable example is Red Skull on Vormir, whose flowing cape and visual design directly evoke Lady Death's iconic outfit from the pages. It's a visual homage that rewards those in the know without requiring explanation for general audiences.
The filmmakers also didn't want to overload the already bloated cast with another major character who'd steal development time from Thanos himself. Because here's the crucial detail. Infinity War needed to dedicate a massive amount of footage to establishing Thanos himself as a three-dimensional, understandable, and to some extent, sympathetic villain in his madness. To achieve this, Marcus and McFeely experimented with multiple radical narrative approaches. At one point, they seriously considered telling the entire complete movie with Thanos' voiceover narration, giving it the structure and tone of a gangster epic told from the protagonist criminal's perspective. Think Goodfellas or The Godfather, but with cosmic genocide. This approach helped them enormously during the writing process to explore Thanos' internal voice, understand his motivations, and develop his twisted philosophy. It allowed them to get inside his head and articulate his distorted logic convincingly. The problem is that after writing several complete drafts with that narration, they realized it became incredibly repetitive and heavy. The constant voiceover killed the dramatic tension and made the film feel more like a documentary about Thanos than an epic battle against him. Additionally, they also experimented writing extensive flashbacks of a much younger Thanos on his home planet of Titan, showing him growing up in a doomed society. They would have seen scenes of him passionately arguing before Titan's leaders, presenting his radical plan to save his people through random elimination of half the population. It was basically his complete origin, explaining how he came to adopt this genocidal philosophy. The problem is, these scenes felt too similar to Jor-El warning Krypton's leaders about their planet's imminent destruction in Superman. It was territory already explored in superhero cinema, and did not anything particularly new or interesting. Worse yet, these extensive flashbacks fatally slowed the film's pacing, constantly interrupting the present narrative to jump to the past and give context the audience could infer in more efficient ways. At the end of the process, after multiple failed drafts, the writers settled on a much more elegant approach. A single flashback centered on the relationship between Thanos and Gamora. That scene where he finds her as a child in the middle of her people's genocide not only revealed his ideology concisely and visually, but also established the emotional connection between both characters. That laid the perfect groundwork for the absolutely devastating emotional punch when Thanos sacrifices his own daughter on Vormir later in the film. One scene doing the work of 10 without needing Lady Death to complicate things.
In the original script drafts, Marcus and McFeely planned to significantly deepen
Thanos' children, giving each member of the Black Order their own backstory, personal motivations, and complete character arcs. They weren't going to be simply generic henchmen serving the main villain, but characters with their own depth. In Jonathan Hickman's comics, specifically in his Infinity run, Proxima Midnight and Corvus Glaive are married. It's not just a strategic alliance, but a genuine romantic relationship that adds emotional layers to their actions. Infinity War's early drafts included complete storylines exploring that relationship, showing their dynamic as a couple, their shared motivations, and how their bond affected their combat decisions. They would have seen scenes of the two interacting intimately, planning strategies together, and showing real chemistry that would have humanized these alien villains. The idea was to establish they weren't simply one-dimensional monsters, but beings with real emotional connections, which would have made their eventual deaths more impactful. In the final version that hit theaters, the only tiny trace of this relationship is a brief, easy-to-miss moment, Proxima's specific reaction when Corvus is stabbed during the Wakanda battle. If you pay very close attention, you can see a flash of personal anguish in her body language, a subtle, almost invisible nod to their emotional bond. But if you blink, you miss it. It's all that remained of an entire subplot that caught cut. Ultimately, all these narrative threads about Thanos' children were eliminated for a practical and sensible reason. The movie was already absurdly packed with characters fiercely competing for screen time. You had to balance all the Avengers, all the Guardians of the Galaxy, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, Black Panther, and his Wakanda cast, and of course, Thanos himself. Adding significant character development for 4 secondary villains would have been narratively irresponsible. The Russos and writers correctly felt the focus should remain firmly on Thanos himself as the main villain. If you were going to dedicate screen time to developing villains, that time should go to the Mad Titan, not his subordinates. Every minute spent on Proxima and Corvus was a minute stolen from characters the audience actually loved.
But the decision to cut Black Order content went beyond simply eliminating romantic subplots. Their powers were also significantly reduced and modified compared to the comic versions. In Hickman's Infinity series, the Black Order is frankly unstoppable. They're near cosmic level villains, each capable of destroying planets on their own. Their abilities are so absurdly powerful, they require entire teams of superheroes working together just to slow them down temporarily. The film's creative team legitimately worried that if they maintained that power level, these secondary villains would end up eclipsing Thanos himself. Imagine the narrative dissonance. Thanos is supposed to be the ultimate threat, the definitive villain, but his henchmen are so dangerous they steal all the attention. It wouldn't work dramatically. To avoid that problem, each member's abilities were carefully redesigned and calibrated to create more dynamic and balanced battles with the Avengers. Without making them so dominant, the movie became the children of Thanos instead of the story of Thanos. The best example of this redesign is Ebony Maw. In the comics, Maw is a psychic manipulator and master of mental persuasion, capable of controlling minds and twisting wills with just words. He's basically a psychological and philosophical threat more than physical. But for the film, he was completely reinvented as a sorcerer or warlock-like figure with precise and almost artistic control over physical matter. His powers became elegant telekinesis and environmental manipulation, which made him visually interesting on screen and created opportunities for unique fight choreography. His battle against Doctor Strange and Iron Man in New York is completely different from any other fight in the MCU precisely because his powers are so specific and visually distinctive. He turns the environment itself into weapons, manipulates metal and concrete with an artist's grace, and creates combat situations that require creativity to overcome. This reinvention made him a memorable and unique threat without ever eclipsing his master. He was dangerous enough to feel like a real threat, but clearly subordinate to Thanos in the power hierarchy. Perfect balance.
When it came time to integrate the Guardians of the Galaxy into Infinity War, the Russos made the smart decision to bring James Gunn directly into the creative process. After all, Gunn had created and completely defined these characters in 2 successful films. Nobody knew their voices, dynamics, and nuances like him. It would be crazy not to consult him. Gunn didn't just contribute ideas and suggestions. Several of his contributions made it directly into the final script without modifications. The most obvious example is the musical selection. He personally chose the Rubber Band Man by the Spinners for the Guardians opening sequence. That specific song, with its funky groove and contagious energy, perfectly set the light tone before everything went to hell with Thanos' arrival. But his most significant and controversial contribution was about Star-Lord's characterization during one of the movie's most critical moments. In an early script draft, when Gamora makes Peter promise he'll kill her if Thanos captures her, Peter initially couldn't force himself to keep that promise. The scene was written with him hesitating, freezing, being unable to pull the trigger when the moment of truth arrived. Gunn read that version and basically told them, nope, that's wrong. That's not Peter. He passionately argued that Star-Lord, despite all his bravado and immature idiot attitude, absolutely would have honored Gamora's request, not because he didn't love her, but precisely because he loves her deeply. Respecting her autonomy, honoring her will, and preventing her from being tortured or used as a tool was more important than his own feelings. It was the most painful and most adult act of love he could do. The Russos and writers heard that argument and agreed. They changed the scene to show Quill pulling the trigger without hesitation, only for reality to disintegrate because Thanos had already turned his weapon into bubbles using the Reality Stone. It's a devastating moment precisely because Peter does do it, demonstrating how much he's matured as a character since his first appearance. However, there was one note from Gunn the writers definitely didn't take, and it's probably the most controversial. Gunn's firm belief that Star-Lord never would have lost control and punched Thanos on Titan. That moment where Peter discovers Thanos killed Gamora, fills with irrational rage and starts punching him in the face just when the animal's gotten the gauntlet off, effectively dooming the entire universe. Gunn argued it was inconsistent with the character, that Peter, despite his impulse control problems, never would have actively sabotaged such a critical mission at such a crucial moment. That his growth as the Guardians' leader meant he could contain his pain until the immediate threat was neutralized. But the Russos and Marcus and McFeely defended that creative decision to the end. For them, that moment of losing control was fundamental to the whole film's theme. The heroes lose because they're human, because they have emotions, because their compassion and personal connections are both their greatest strength and their Achilles heel. Thanos wins precisely because he's willing to sacrifice what he loves, while the heroes can't. Star-Lord punching Thanos is the perfect demonstration of that human weakness that dooms them. It was probably the most debated decision among fans after the release, with thousands of people arguing online whether Star-Lord was a selfish idiot who doomed the universe, or if his reaction was completely understandable given the trauma. But however you see it, it was intentional, not a writing mistake.
One of the most shocking revelations about Infinity War is how much of its emotional devastation wasn't actually in the original script. The Russos confirmed in later interviews that Peter Parker's absolutely heartbreaking goodbye to Tony Stark was almost completely improvised by Tom Holland in the moment. In the script as written on paper, the only line Peter had during his death was simple and direct. "I don't feel so good." That was it. Forwards. A clinical description of the snap's effects starting to hit him. Functional, but not particularly emotive or memorable. But the Russos, knowing Holland's talent and wanting to take that moment way further, gave him specific direction: improvise. They wanted Tom to explore Peter's genuine terror in that instant, the panic of a teenager realizing he's dying and can't do anything to stop it. What followed was pure acting magic. Holland delivered those desperate, repeated pleas of "I don't want to go, I don't want to go, please, I'm sorry," that became one of the most emotional and quoted scenes in the entire film. The break in his voice, the real terror in his eyes, the way he clings to Tony seeking security Stark can't provide, it was all Holland working in the moment, channeling the character's vulnerability completely organically. The filmmakers explained later there was a specific reason why Peter's death extended longer and was more painful than the other disintegrations. Spider-Man's spider sense, that instinctive power that alerts him to danger, let him feel the snap taking effect before it actually happened. While other heroes simply disintegrated almost instantly, Peter had those agonizing seconds of anticipation, knowing it was coming
coming but being unable to avoid it. That's why his death lingers so long on screen, stretching out the suffering for him, Tony, and the audience. But that wasn't the only heartbreaking revelation about the snap death. James Gunn, always attentive to his character's emotional details, later confirmed on social media a detail most audiences never heard or noticed. Groot's last word before turning to dust was "Dad," directed straight at Rocket. This is only audible if you speak a Groot's language. For everyone else, including Rocket himself, it just sounded like his usual "I'm Groot." But for those who can understand it, like the directors and writers, Groot is calling Rocket his father figure in his final moment of life. It was a subtle, almost invisible detail, but one that brutally and perfectly underscored how cruel and personal the snap really was. It wasn't just an abstract cosmic event. They were individual deaths, each with its own emotional weight, each destroying specific connections. The snap didn't just eliminate half the life in the universe, it destroyed families, broke relationships, and left survivors traumatized in unique and personal ways. Those improvised and hidden details are what elevated the snap from the visual spectacle to genuine emotional devastation.
At the end of the day, when you break down the entire chaotic, desperate, improvised process behind Infinity War, you realize something disturbing. This movie had no right working as well as it did. It was built on foundations of constant rewrites, ideas completely scrapped after investing millions, and last-minute changes that could have destroyed the entire project. Marvel literally spent years making it up as they went, making retroactive decisions that modified the continuity of already released films. They turned the ether into an Infinity Stone at the last minute, forced James Gunn to explain fundamental concepts and 3 minutes of rush writing, and retroactively declared the Infinity Gauntlet at Asgard's fault was fake after years of confusing fans. They threw out random Easter eggs without having the slightest clue how they'd connect them later, betting their future selves would solve the problems their present selves were irresponsibly creating. They had to cut entire characters like Nova after filming his origin, eliminate Professor Hulk after writing Endgame scenes assuming he existed, and discard a giant serpent battle that probably cost a fortune to conceptualize. The writers openly admitted they panicked over their own drafts when nobody at Marvel supported them. Actors like Chris Hemsworth basically had to save their own characters from irrelevance by insisting on fundamental changes. The narrative structure got rewritten multiple times, moving epic moments between characters, eliminating complete sequences that would have changed the film's tone, and adjusting character arcs on the fly while other MCU films were filming simultaneously. And yet somehow, all that creative chaos channeled into something extraordinary. It consolidated into a film that worked not just as visual spectacle or fan service, but as a coherent narrative with real emotional weight. A movie where decisions had consequences, where characters felt true to themselves, and where the final defeat was devastating precisely because we'd spent years emotionally investing in these heroes. It all culminated in that chilling, perfectly executed moment. Thanos snapping his fingers in Wakanda, Thor desperately screaming, "What did you do?" And the Mad Titan smiling as he responds with absolute certainty, "I was inevitable." And then he disappears through the portal, leaving the surviving heroes processing the trauma of having failed so completely. That moment works because despite all the chaotic improvisation behind the scenes, the filmmakers and writers stayed true to the central promise. This time, the heroes were gonna lose. And that defeat had to hurt, had to feel earned, had to devastate both the characters and the audience. They pulled it off not because they had a perfect master plan from the beginning, but because they were willing to change, adapt, and sacrifice precious ideas when they didn't work. Infinity War is a reminder that sometimes the best art emerges from controlled chaos, from the willingness to throw away months of work when it doesn't function, and from the humility to listen when actors, writers, and directors tell you something isn't right. It's an accidental miracle we'll probably never see again at this scale.
Smash that subscribe button if this video completely changed how you see Infinity War and showed you the real chaos behind the success, because every week I break down the craziest secrets behind the most epic movies in cinema so you can discover the stories the studios never wanted you to know.